Welcome to another episode of Living Lives with Khalid. Today, my guest is a very dear friend of mine, Richard Pattle. Richard is a man of many hats. He has been in the military, and he has worked for His Royal Highness Prince Charles as Master of the Household, and he's later moved on to become part of Standard Chartered as Vice Chairman of their private bank, and later on was CEO of a construction company, I believe hospitals. I could be wrong, but we will discuss that in a second. And now he has joined the True Beacon team, which is a fund investing in India. And so, hey, Richard, how are you doing?
It's good to see you, Khalid. I'm sorry we're not in the same. I'm sorry we're not in the same room and conducting this in person. But I'm speaking to you from South India, Bangalore, where I've been for the last 4.5 months or so. So another week to go here, and then finally back to family.
Finally going back home to London. You must be thrilled.
Yeah. Yeah, do you know? I mean, it's been. I can't complain. I've staying in an amazing hotel here. I've managed to do some work. I've kept occupied, and also, I'm sure we'll touch on my love of India and later on. But it's tough not being there with the family and so on, who are all locked down. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But it's been an incredible journey for you being in India as well, I'm sure. You guys have, because the market changed significantly because of Corona, as the viewers and you, of course, know. And so it must have been an incredible experience to be a part of the changes that have occurred and how to adapt and adjust to the market situation, as well as the philanthropic endeavors that you guys have taken as True Beacon. Can you talk a little bit about that? How has that been for you?
Yeah, it's been, actually, you're right. It's been fascinating to be here in India. It's been wherever you've been, locked down around the world. Obviously, most of us are focused on that particular country. What I've seen in India was, to begin with, India fared very well in this whole episode. There was a dramatic and quite a short notice lockdown. I think it was something like 3.5 hours we all had, which is hence I'm staying in the country back in March, at the end of March. And that seemed to be very effective in terms of containing it. Sadly, at the time of recording, it doesn't look quite like the case. And we have quite a few hotspots across India, not least this one where I'm sitting in now, Bangalore. But obviously, a country like India is even more affected when you suddenly turn off the economy or sort of paralyze it or hibernate it at very short notice. Because a lot of people here rely on their daily wages, which are in cash. It might be, $5-10 a day if they're lucky. And suddenly their families are without. So, it's been very interesting to be here to see what effect that's had on the economy, but also to be part of a very small part of a philanthropic effort here to help feed, in particular, families here in the city and across Karnataka, the state that I'm in as well.
Yeah, definitely. So we're gonna circle back to more on India, but I want to, because you've done so much in your life, I want to take the listeners through the journey that you've done and through your experiences. And I know philanthropy is a key feature and a huge role in your life, and so I want to also discuss that in more details. But first of all, let's start with young Richard joining the military. And how has that been? How has that experience, and what have you gained from it, and what remains with you till today from that experience?
Well, to start off, I grew up in the UK, and I think most of my peer group, when I was a small boy, wanted to be pilots or train drivers or anything that was seemed to be out of the ordinary. I wanted to be a bank manager back then when I was a little bit. And so I ended up actually joining the military totally and utterly by accident, like most of my chapters in my life. One of my best friends at school joined cadets. I ended up joining cadets as well. I was very lucky and fortunate. I started to do lots of adventure training when I was a teenager. I got my gliding license at the age of 16. I got my flying license for fixed-wing aircraft at 17.
Wow.
And then joined the Royal Air Force and spent 18 years or so. It was an incredible, incredible chapter for me. It was, I feel very blessed that I was able to take all of those opportunities to learn a tiny bit from everyone along the way, and also to have experiences that most people don't have. And there's a real camaraderie, of course, in any military around the world, but particularly in very testing environments, and that's typically combat zones and warfighting operations and so on. But also just the fact of day-to-day flying, the dependency you have on each other as a crew, and then I think holds you in good stead for the rest of your life, because it really does illustrate teamwork, not through theory, but through practice. And the consequences of a team not performing, obviously in some cases, can be life-threatening.
Yeah. And it's definitely a present role that I've even witnessed in your life as just a friend, that teamwork and bringing people together is one of the main pillars of that make you. And it's not surprising that you gained that, or at least it started the foundation from this military experience.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, most military and officer training schools around the world have got a pretty sharp induction to the world of teams. You go off typically for, let's say, a year or so through an officer training school, and it's less about just getting physically fit, although that is a part of it. It's more about how you can assemble high-performing teams, lead those teams effectively, because I think a lot of people who haven't been in the military assume that it's all about how you order people to do things. And actually you find out in the military very, very quickly that, you might have a different, rank tab on your shoulder, but in effect, people will follow you in times of critical danger sometimes and so on, because of you as an individual. And so that I think has been very valuable to me throughout my subsequent careers as well. But it was, I think leadership and so on, maybe we'll come back to it. And I don't pretend to be an expert or anything. I have seen and worked with some fantastic leaders, but I think a lot of it is how you react in a certain situation and how you experiment with a leadership style and you tailor it. And you also learn massively from times it doesn't work as well.
Yeah. It also depends on the team that you're leading as well, and the corporate culture, I'm sure, of the team as well, and how to steer them differently.
Yeah.
And
I think that's right. I think it's very much, on individuals. There's no one right recipe for leadership, full stop. But even more so when you consider that you might be leading people that who perhaps are very culturally like you might be leading international, especially in the military, you might be leading international teams of many different nations, and you have to completely change your leadership style to do that as well. I was lucky during my time that I served both alongside and also led elements of NATO forces, United Nations, and so on. And all of that brings different joys, but also challenges as well.
Of course. Which brings me to the next concept of adaptability. I mean, you've done so many different things in your career, and now we have to adapt as a leader throughout those careers. So I have two questions. How do you find joy in all these different industries? Because you went from military to a royal household to banking, and then to construction, and now to a fund. So how do you find joy in such different industries, even though there are some connectivity between all of them? What joys do you find in all of these, and how do you find adaptability how do you adapt as an individual to these new roles and new challenges that you have to face?
I think the first question here, how do you find joy? If you don't find joy in something, I think stop doing it. I mean, there will be challenges in everything that you do, and it's, not every single day is going to be fantastic. And but generally, in all of my careers and little chapters in life, I've loved them, and I think if you can find joy in something, you enjoy it, you become good at it, and everything else follows. So I think that a lot of this is about your attitude to kind of reinventing yourself and so on. And I've always been very open to reinventing myself, but also realizing, as you get older, I'm now 50 One, who you are and what you're good at, and more importantly, I think what you're terrible at, and sort of kind of investing in the bits of you that you can really make the most progress in, and steering away from elements in life that are not going to ever satisfy and fulfill you. So I think, as you say, that's a good word. Joy is very important in anything that you do professionally, just because I think it does sort of shine through. Whenever I've worked with people and for people, and I've had people working for me, it's very evident who has that joy, often described as passion for something. And more often than not, even if people aren't technically brilliant at something, the joy, the passion will take them almost all the way. In terms of adaptability, I think that, as I say, I've never planned my life. I feel incredibly blessed that I've had a whole range of what I consider to be very interesting roles that I could do. And I think that, again, being adaptable, or just working out how you can take some of your previous experiences and then leverage them in your next role, and also to some degree sort of carve out a little bit of a new role, recognizing who you are, is increasingly important. I've got 3 teenage children. They are unlikely to have 2 or 3 careers. They will probably have, who knows, 6, 7, 8 careers in their lifetime. And I think as we all grow and live longer, that's an increasingly important element to do. And although in my life I've never really been a deep specialist, I've been very fortunate to become quite a generalist and being forced in different arenas, thinking back in the military, working in the Ministry of Defence, for example, in a new area or I knew nothing about, but able to kind of assimilate as much as you can and then to learn. And then the military also teaches you that your life is really carved up into little segments, and they're normally never longer than 2 years, probably never shorter than 6 months, but you're thrown into the deep end of a new subject area you might not know anything about. Did equipment, procurement, everything from that through to the press office, working in the Ministry of Defence and the media and so on, as a ground job in addition to my flying duties. And I think it sort of prepares you for the future quite well.
Yeah. And I think you also have the ability to bring people together. So even when you're faced with something new, and a new industry with new challenges, I think you're the type of person that also is open to learning from others, and you empower others. At least that's what I got. So what is the role of empowerment within a team that you've had where you guys, especially since you've been in so many industries, how has empowerment benefited the projects that you worked on and the level of productivity within the teams that you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a leader, I think one of the greatest challenges that most leaders have, and I really suffer from this, is about effective delegation. Mm-hmm. And if you're a bit of a control freak, or you really want to get into what happens on the ground, it is difficult to say to people, listen, this is what ultimately the team needs to achieve. This is what you need to do as an individual, and then allow them the time and the space to hopefully succeed. But 5% of the times they may well fail. And I've learned, I think, during my time that it is better to accept that 5% failure, that in 95% of cases, the overwhelming majority of people relish responsibility. They relish the chance to really drive something themselves and contribute to the team, and they will deliver. But it is, not without its risk, and sometimes you have to be very careful about what risks are assigned to people who take on that. So I think empowering people on your team is a vital part of being a leader, and management skills as well. But I think it also means setting boundaries in terms of what they can do, what they can't do, the autonomy that they have, but also coming back and having a good sort of feedback loop so that they can communicate any issues or problems, and they can also get, crucially, either you to help or one of the rest of the team to help them as well. But it's very important, and I'm sure we've all worked for people who haven't been like that, and it can be very stifling for people, and doesn't bring out the best either.
Yeah. And how do you deal with this 5% of failures that happen and occur?
Yeah.
How do you motivate the individual that failed, and how do you transform that failure and again adapt to the situation where they failed to accomplish a task that might have been crucial towards the entire goal of the team? How can you transform that failure and make it a non-durable one?
Yeah, I mean, I think failure, and you'll know this, Khalid, because you've spent, been educated in the US, which has a very positive attitude towards failure, for example, as other countries do as well. But in some cultures, failure is an enormous weakness. I've always taken the view that to fail once is incredibly beneficial, as long as it's not kind of life-threatening to either the business that you're in or indeed the military operation that you're undertaking. But failure for all of us is incredibly positive. I've failed myself in life so many times, and the ability to learn from it, to dust yourself down, to get going again, I think can be very beneficial for your future careers. I think you have to have the same attitude with those people who work for you and alongside you as well. I think to fail once is fine. To fail twice at the same mission or task and so on, obviously is a very different type of failure, and that means that either there's been not enough remedial action for the individual that's carrying out that, or the task has been too demanding for them, or probably most likely that person is not going to be able to develop the required skills to carry out that, and then obviously you have to change the team to take that into account.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to what you said as well. It's all about passion in the end. If they're passionate about it as well, then they're going to be more likely to absorb from the failure the lessons that are learned. If they're not very passionate about it, then they're just going to brush off that lesson and just continue doing what they do, because especially if there's no repercussions the first or second time as well. And based on my experience, I think it was very important because I've definitely made some mistakes with some clients. As long as they're not, the lifeblood of the business, I think it's important for you to learn from these, so that once you build up the lessons, so that when you are faced with a very huge deal or with an important, significant chapter in the business's history, or the challenges or whatever it is that you're focusing on, that you're able to take all those lessons and transform them into something successful. Because maybe this was a failure at this point, but then I learned a lesson that will make me win the bigger fish, let's say, in the future. So I think it's very important to not, like you said, be down, but get up and dust yourself off and continue.
Yeah, I think, whether you're managing a team or whether, are now a dad and you want your children naturally to be incredibly successful, and you want them to have the best possible life and all of the opportunities that will bring. But you also don't want them to find out what failure is until they're, in their mid-20s or something. It's a good thing to be exposed to failure relatively early on in life, because it doesn't matter who you are, which family you come from, your background, your wealth, whatever it might be. All of us will end up failing at some stage and learning from it. And I think if you can have the type of attitude that, failure is never nice. It's not a nice experience to go through. But if you can be, if you can analyze it properly, if you can put it into context, and most importantly, if you can learn from it, I think, as I say, I think it's really positive.
I agree. So this makes me move to the next career that you had, which was the Master of the Household for His Royal Highness Prince Charles. How was that experience, and what were the biggest benefits from that job in terms of lessons, life lessons, and what was your role exactly in the household? How did you come across that, and what was the biggest lessons, as I said?
Yeah, I probably won't talk about that chapter too much, just because
Of course.
it's a very private chapter to have. But I was very privileged to work for the Prince of Wales and Duchess of Cornwall for two separate stints. First of all, as a query when I was on military secondment from the military, and then latterly as Master of the Household. I think it was, again, incredibly broadening and inspirational time for me in particular. I loved every second of it. I learned hugely from their Royal Highnesses and for those that I worked with. But I think, jobs like that give you great breadth, again, because of the work of that particular institution and being so active across all areas of public life, whether it's philanthropy and business and so on. You get to learn a little bit about so many different areas. So that was really broadening for me. And after that, as you know, I went off to join the private sector for the first time in my life.
Yeah, and how was that transition? What did you? How did you come about joining Standard Chartered? I know you said you wanted to be a banker from a very young age, and you finally managed to steer your way into that industry. And was that by chance? Did you? How did you fall upon that job? And what made you? Did you start in England and then come to Dubai? Because that's where we met. We met in Dubai when you were based in Standard Chartered in Dubai. So let me know about that experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, serendipity is fantastic as a thread that runs through my life. But I ended up meeting some of the senior leadership in Standard Chartered Bank. Was leaving the royal household in any case, and we just started to talk about where they were in terms of growing their private bank, and there was, I think, a good sort of meeting of minds around what they needed and some of the experiences that I'd had in my previous careers. But for me, actually, I think that I also was very fortunate to work for a woman who was leading the private bank. And ended up having a much broader and more senior role there as well. She incredibly impressive individual. And I think actually, talking about leadership and teams and so on, I met her and I thought, listen, I'd love to be on her team. She obviously had great abilities in terms of putting together management and so on. So that was one of the key attractions. But also Standard Chartered as a bank is probably played to all of my strengths from before. It's a British bank, obviously. It's got a history throughout the Commonwealth. I've had some exposure to the Commonwealth, that block of nations and so on. And the role as well was not a traditional banking role in which I'd have to start from scratch and try and play catch up with guys and girls who are 20 years, or to have 20 years more experience. But actually, I was lucky enough to have my own niche where I exclusively dealt with ultra high net worth families, but also not in the pure traditional banking silos, but more on putting these leading families together, generating the next generation, which is something you've been involved with, Khalid, and so on. The Commonwealth, Britain, and trying really to leverage all of the client base for the benefit of the clients themselves, so that they ultimately end up having deeper relationships with Standard Chartered.
Yeah, and that's where you developed Future Global Leaders program, which has been an incredible experience, and it's really your personality shined in that program because you have this ability to bring people together and to create an environment where people just feel not only comfortable with one another but also like family. And I think it also builds on your experiences that you've had in the past. So how were you able to achieve that level of creating those bonds that will most likely be lifelong bonds for all these different individuals?
I mean, I can't,
from different backgrounds as well.
Yeah. I mean, I can't pretend that I did anything other than look at how, in my case, the British military acts as this incredible way to gel people together in a very, very short space of time. And Future Global Leaders Program started back in 2015, but it was relatively a short period of time, 7 or 8 days. But I learned in the military, if you could put people together in demanding, and not just physically, but mentally demanding environments, and give them really memorable experiences, and also make them feel as though they weren't just a member of a dreary course, but to be given, I always call it sort of front row seats on a course. You know, I always have this mantra, you probably saw it on the last Future Global Leaders Program. None of our participants ever sit on a second row. They're always on the first row, normally, you know, round a speaker, an inspirational person, a philanthropist, a diplomat, or a business person, learning from them, but engaging with them in a very senior peer-to-peer way. So I think it's really sort of officer training that gives you that window onto how teams can be put together very, very quickly. And there are bigger challenges with doing it in 8 days. But I think it's really good fun, particularly for the cohort that went through all of these. They're all facing their own different issues, problems and challenges, and they all come from wealthy families. But actually, sometimes, very often in life, that gives you an added sense of responsibility, an added burden that people on the street probably don't understand. But once you have a window into that community, you understand that's one of the leading problems for those families, not just as individuals, but also for multi-generational families.
Because you have the responsibility to better the world around you.
Yeah, you do. I mean, you have so many different responsibilities. You know, number one, you've got a responsibility, particularly once you get sort of third generation and beyond, you've got a big responsibility about your family's legacy. If your grandmother has started a leading conglomerate in the Middle East, let's say, and you know your time is there, you're on. You know, you will be judged about whether you have taken that business and made it even more successful, or whether actually you've been at the helm when things go very spectacularly badly wrong. And those pressures are enormous. But there are also other elements, I think, in terms of the family. You have to keep on reinventing the family business. You have to build in technology. You have to be far more visible than the old days, perhaps, for promoter-owned, family-owned businesses. And so it's tough. I often say that the guys and girls who've been through the program, and you'll know this, Scarlett, you know, they've been to the best universities in the world. But even those universities in the world cannot prepare you for the pressure you will feel as being the daughter or the son of, in very many cases, a household name, someone who's known for their business, their acumen, the corporate that they've grown. And that, I think, is tough. And I think one of the great things about the program is that it allows individuals to talk to each other, their peer group, in a very safe space, rather than talking to others like me, for example, who, you know, are never going to have that issue, that problem of being a billionaire or double-digit billionaire, whatever it might be. But to actually talk to your peer group from around the world, to compare notes in total confidence about what the pressures that you're facing are, I think is, you know, invaluable for them. That's the feedback we've got anyway.
Definitely. Like you said, there's a huge gap between academics and then actually being on the ground, and then having access to all these peers that have similar obstacles facing them. It's incredible to just exchange notes and inspire one another, and also to bring the world together, because they're all coming from different backgrounds as well, which moves me to the next topic of globalization. Although it's been present for the past thousands of years with technology and with airplanes and with Zoom and everything, now the world's been more connected and everything is much faster, and it accelerated this growth of the global economy. And how important is globalization to you, and how important is it in shaping the world in the future and the future generations, especially because now there's some resistance from a lot of different groups towards this globalization. But people like me and you have witnessed the reality and the benefits of coming together and bringing people together, and how we have more similarities than differences. So what do we have to learn from globalization, and why is it so crucial towards the development of the human race as a whole?
Yeah, well, you're right. Characters like you and me have been enormous beneficiaries of globalization. But we are at a juncture, and we have been now for several years, where globalization tragically has left behind, many billions of people on this planet. And when you try to explain the benefits of globalization, if you can't, for example, in a country that I'm sitting in now, in India, if you can't say that, people's lives in rural India are dramatically increasing very, very quickly, then globalization probably hasn't had a very positive effect on them. Although in this country, people are thankfully being moved from poverty to better and to have a greater opportunities. But I think, as we've seen in the US, in the UK, in particular other Western countries, also countries which perhaps have got a very young demographic, globalization just hasn't reached all the parts that it was meant to. And if you are in the US, in a traditional manufacturing area, for example, and globalization has not led to any benefits for you, but has actually destroyed jobs, you can understand why people are resentful about that, and they see globalization as a very negative piece. I think there are two elements to globalization, at least. There are many, many elements, but if you look at them, there's economic globalization and there's political globalization. And I think that one of the key benefits, if you look through history at the most turbulent times of conflict, whether you call it globalization or you also look at institutions that have made the world a safer place, it's all about increasing the amount of dialogue between nations on the planet. That's how we make a safer world. Hopefully we make a more prosperous world through globalization in the business sense. But that I think hasn't been so successful to date. I think that we've also seen politically that it is a pretty easy bandwagon to jump on if you're a political leader, to rail about globalization, to be more of a nationalist. And obviously that reinforces some of the characteristics that lead to globalization failing people. But I hope that perhaps we will, and particularly now, as we're all interacting differently and we've gone into more of a virtual world, we'll see whether we rebound to life before COVID-19 as it was and so on. But I do hope that globalization in its new chapter will be far more effective for people. And I think that, you talked about sustainability earlier on. What globalization should be doing is, for the billions of people on the planet, it should be increasing their access to everything that the Sustainable Development Goals, which were launched back in 2015, there are 17 of them. And whether it's through equality for men and women, whether it's through just the very basics of having clean drinking water, whether it's through education, these are all elements that are crucial for everyone on planet Earth, and we need to focus on them. And whether globalization per se is the route to get to that, I don't know. But I think they're even more important as a roadmap, as a blueprint for our continued success, whilst bearing in mind, the sustainability challenges that we all face as well.
So I have a couple of comments on that. One is, you're right. So globalization has been a double-edged sword, because a lot of people did not benefit from it, but at the same time they did, but in things that don't resonate with them because they've been a given now. And what I mean by that, like, for example, Google or iPhone, they're all from immigrants. and people use them daily. And I'm sure also healthcare improved significantly because of globalization. You know, you have medicine coming from Germany, you have medicine from the East, you have medicine, you know, especially you can see this with the vaccine as well for the corona. People are racing from all over the globe to try and bring about a solution. And therefore, I think it did improve the lives in general, in the general sense, not necessarily in a sense of monetary value towards people that are in manufacturing jobs, let's say. I think there's been one thing that you touched on, which was education. I think there hasn't been a proper educational foundation to allow these people to, again, to the concept of adapting, to adapt to this globalization, because these manufacturers and farmers could have used globalization, but they were not taught how to properly use the tools. And I think that's where the gap personally exists. But I think also this moves me to the next thing. I think that we have enough resources in the world to abolish 5 main pillars, which are healthcare. I think everyone should have access to healthcare. Everyone should have access to food and water. A roof on your head where you have water, you know, and food and all of that. And then also Wi-Fi in today's world. And finally, you need to have access to education. And I think what that will create, if we abolish these 5 things, you will get access to all these individuals that are educated and have the foundation to actually create value. And then people that have already a lot of success can invest in these new businesses that are upcoming, and therefore own equity, and therefore also create more value for themselves. And therefore you have a bigger economy, bigger GDP. But then you have the issue of overpopulation, which will eventually reach that stage. So I don't think there's an easy solution to this. But those are my 2 cents. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think education. One observation I make on education is that when you think about it, how we're all educated and when we're educated, typically now in many countries around the world, at least half of the population will go to university, do an undergraduate degree, then there'll be a significant and increasing proportion that go on and do a postgraduate degree and so on. But if you also think about it, we're educated from, you know, let's say the age of 4, certainly until 18, in many cases until 21, 22. And then there is little formal education that takes you through the rest of your life. And, you know, we're all living longer. We're going to have to be far more adaptable. There are new skills that are starting. You know, digitization and technology means that, you know, old dinosaurs like me, we genuinely can't keep up with what's going on. We've never been immersed in it since, you know, childhood, unlike you, for example, as a guy who's half my age, I think. But, you know, these are massive challenges. And I think that the pursuit and the inflation of a university degree and above in itself doesn't help. I think that, you know, it's incredibly expensive now in many nations just to get an undergraduate degree, let alone a postgrad. Yeah. And if you're starting off your life in a whole, you know, heap of debt, I think mentally that's not good for an individual. So you have to look at how that investment is being spent, but also really critically when. And I think that we'll end up with an educational system that is perhaps shorter at that period of your life before you go into the world of work, but is far more flexible for you to be able to pick it up. And I'm not talking about just merely an individual doing online degrees or going back to do an MBA or whatever it might be. But I think that we may well, in some countries, go to a more formalized system where in different decades of your life, you undertake different educational experiences as a formed cohort. And I think that's really good. And I think it'll also allow people to reinvent themselves, to go into different industries, to learn about what's been happening in those, in those 10, 15 years since they last did any formal sense of education. But, you know, that is difficult. This is difficult to imagine right now, not least because there are so many millions of people around the world who don't have access to quality education right now.
Yeah.
And, that has to be the number one priority, to get everyone up to a common standard, so that across different religions, obviously between male and female, but cultural backgrounds, wealth and so on, at least people have a benchmark that will give them opportunities to do something extraordinary in life.
Definitely. I think education has been one of the most important factors in my life. It really accelerated my growth and my understanding. But I definitely do think that there's a gap between reality and being on the ground and being in a professional career versus what you learn in school. And I don't think that the current education system is as best as it can be. I mean, there are so many. Well, first we can start with, like you said, the student debt. It doesn't even make sense for schools to be that expensive. And what bank, if it wasn't categorized as a student loan, would give an 18-year-old who has never had proper job, maybe except a part-time job, $60,000, $70,000, $200,000? That doesn't make sense. He doesn't have an income, or she doesn't have an income. Why would you loan out that money? And then you have that burden for most of your life for a lot of people. And also the school system itself. I mean, I've learned a lot from my university, and I'm forever grateful for it. But there were certain credits and criteria that I had to take that were not related to my major per se, which felt like redundant. I mean, in some cases they were incredible. Like, I took this class about the history of Southeast Asia and anthropology, basically, and it discussed, Indonesia, what happened in Indonesia, what happened in the Philippines, and all these things, and I learned so much. But then I had to take classes like sex, gender, and society, where I get it might be, someone's passion to learn that, and to each their own. But I felt like it was an utter waste of my time to be in that class and some certain classes. So I think we still have a long way to go towards perfecting this educational system. But I think we do need to have the conversation of how can we figure out a way to mold the system to be more beneficial, because there are a lot of things that you don't necessarily need in nowadays, especially with, like you said, technological advancements. I can just use a calculator to figure out so many different things, or ask Google. So why am I being tested the old-fashioned way, rather than it being solely critical thinking rather than mathematical per se? I mean, math, of course, is something very, very important. I'm not saying we shouldn't learn math, but I'm saying it needs to be altered and adjusted towards the current state of reality, which is we do have access to these things. So how can we create an edge while using this technology to advance us, rather than test us without this technology? Because the reality is we have it. So how can we use it to become even better? And I think that's where we should be moving towards, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I a couple of observations. I spend quite a lot of time, as many people do in the corporate world, recruiting young men and women. And now, particularly amongst those who aspire to work for corporates or go into the financial services sector, let's say, for example, they're all very highly educated. When you're selecting those individuals, even just to get through to an interview, it's incredibly difficult to actually make any one of those CVs stand out, pop out. Once in a blue moon, stuff does pop out at you, and that person inevitably will get to the interview. So I think there's a lot of stuff during your initial education that you need to do that really is a differentiator for yourself and makes you stand out, makes you more compelling in the jobs market. And whether it is something that you do vocationally, whether it is a philanthropic effort that you've done, whether it might just be the fact that you've cared for your parents during illness and you've had to make very huge personal sacrifices to do that. That all really helps you. Just, I think, gliding through school and university without that, those days are over, those types of jobs. There's no entitlement to those types of people. So I think that's a big part of how education needs to equip people to get into the jobs market. But more importantly, probably, is I also think that education needs to equip young men and women to thrive in that new scenario. If you look at some of the leading corporates, they all have very different cultures, of course, but the soft skills about being part of a team, about knowing how far to push something, knowing when to choose your battles in the corporate workspace, perhaps, sadly, if organizations have, politics within them, as many big international firms do. How to navigate those, how to influence not just those people who work with you, but also influence your bosses, which is actually a key part of the corporate world. And I think, with certain exceptions, there's probably not enough emphasis at the moment on that. As I think one of the benefits of obviously all of us spending a lot more time learning during the COVID crisis has been, I think a lot of people have been thinking, how can I develop my character, my personality, my skill set to allow me to be more effective in the workplace? So, I think that also will change in the future.
Yeah, I agree. And also I think this corporate politics and or the politics that is present in corporations should be taught, because it's a valuable skill to have. I mean, thankfully I've been blessed not having, because I work for a family company and I was also the first employee in Dubai, I didn't really face that issue. I mean, as a leader also, it is very difficult to motivate a team, and I found that difficulties, especially being, having people that are older than me with more experience than me in the team. So it's very difficult to navigate that. But more so, I think I've heard so many of my friends discuss the office politics that they have to go through, whether it's with their boss, whether it's with the different colleagues, and how there is a competition sense when they're all working for the same company. So I think the most crucial and important aspect of a company's success is to align everyone. You're not necessarily in a competitive environment rather than in a collaborative environment to create what's best for the company and therefore for you as well, because you also have to be rewarded for doing so, I think. So I think that's something, and I think because of working from home now, there might be a shift. I don't think you can ever eliminate offices, because there's a lot of benefit of being face-to-face interaction. And, I mean, I'm talking to you over Zoom right now. It's incredible. Yeah. I love talking to you as usual, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's different if we were sitting in a room, and we would have, it's more interactive. So I think this work from home environment, some people saw productivity levels shoot up for some teams. I was discussing it with one of my friends. He was saying, the productivity of his engineers in the company went up, and therefore now they're going to allow them to work more from home, but have the option of coming to the office. So there's going to be like a new development after Corona, which I'm very looking forward to see. And hopefully people will learn from this time rather than forget and continue as everything was. This moves me
I do think, Khalid, though, again, just looking at what I've been doing here in India, and perhaps we'll come back to it later, but setting up and helping set up a new team here. I think technology, Zoom calls, the way, of course there's been a big wake-up call. Why on earth did I fly 16 hours for a 4-hour meeting when I could have done it on Zoom? But yes, you can up to a point. But I think that we know each other incredibly well. We can explain things to you. I can see in your face, in your body language, and in your eyes whether you understand something, whether you're in agreement with me. All of those soft skills, it's relatively easy for us to do. If, on the other hand, you're forming a team from scratch virtually, that is a very, very different proposition. And only time will tell when, obviously, we work through this. Teams around the world get the inevitable churn. People that may have never met each other, but they've had to be part of a virtual team. We'll see how effective they are then. My own experience so far is that there's no substitute really for forming those professional, personal relationships as a team, and then leveraging those in the virtual space. But it's been, I don't think life will go back to how it was, for sure. But neither do I think that we're all going to work from home and stay in our pajamas all day. And I do think there is definitely a space for all of us to be, physically together in some sort of workspace, but probably not as rigid, for sure, as it was beforehand.
Definitely. I 100% agree with you. I think it's a very crucial, as you touched on it, if you're building a team from scratch, for them to build it in the same area, because you can also, you never know when you have someone's focus. If you're a new team, I could be talking to you on Zoom and listening, especially if there's 4, 6, 8, 10 people in the call. 1 or 2 people could be, doing stuff in the background or checking out other stuff on their laptop, and you wouldn't really know. So I'm sure the engagement is not also fully there. Now I'd like to move to the construction job that you had in India. Could you walk us through that and how that experience was? Because you were back on the ground. You went from the banking environment and dealing with the high net worth families and I'm assuming great settings, whether they were restaurants, homes, businesses, offices, to being on the ground. And how was that and managing that team and a new also modern way of construction as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, not for the first time during our conversation, I used the word serendipity, but I met an amazing family, an Indian family, during my time at Standard Chartered. I ended up being the CEO for their holding company based in Dubai, but the operating company is primarily in construction, but also in healthcare, with other investments too, was all here in India. And India is one of my sort of non-negotiable passion points in life. I came here for the first time 30 years ago. As you know, I think I did a year's exchange with the Indian Armed Forces while I was in the military. I used to come back here when I was in the royal household, heavily when I was at Standard Chartered. This country is literally my second home, and I adore it. And to go and work for an Indian entrepreneur, someone who had an incredible track record but was very forward thinking, was very, very exciting. And it also gave me the opportunity to come down and, not since my days working with the Indian Armed Forces, put myself into an Indian corporate sort of environment as well in terms of a business, one that we ended up merging in the end with an American company. But it was a really instructive, exciting, just over a year or so that I spent doing that. And again, did I know anything whatsoever about construction before I started the job? No. Did I know that much more when I finished the job? Probably not. But I knew some of the fundamentals, and I had an amazing boss as well who I learned from. And I think a lot of life is about learning along the way. You learn from people you either work with or for, in particular. I now learn a lot for people who work for me as well. It's a great new chapter that I'm in as a middle-aged guy. That has really stood me in good stead for what I'm doing now in India, and was great fun. And you see in the construction world that actually, again, there are great parallels with the military. If you're putting together a big military operation, you might have thousands of people who are assembled at sea, in the air, on the ground to, for example, rescue one individual in a hostile scenario and environment. And those individuals all come together in pursuit of that one mission. And construction, in a way, is all about that. It's all about the finished product, which needs to be assembled, needs to be manufactured and assembled and effectively put together for the end consumer in a very methodical, logical, efficient way. And I think that my exposure to that industry, to the family that I work for, was very beneficial in giving me another great rounding in life, and also in the end, as it transpired, has set me up for what I'm doing here in India now.
Yeah, which is a great segue. So now you're working with True Beacon, and you're investing in India, and there's a lot of potential in India. And so how has that role been? Because it's been 6 to 10 months, I want to say, since you've officially formed. And then, of course, as you were investing, Corona hit, and I know the stock market took a hit, I believe in February. How have you adjusted, and what's your outlook on the future of the market? I mean, it's a very still promising market with an increasing population and an increasing investments, and a lot of returns that have not been yet capitalized on. And how are you guys? What differentiates you, and what have you guys been doing?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there. There's about 18 questions piled into one.
Yeah. Trying to make your job super easy here, huh?
Exactly. Here's an answer. This is a really exciting chapter. So again, for forgive me for using the word serendipity, but again, I met the co-founders of a company here called Zerodha, which is one of the unicorns based out of Bangalore, started by these two brothers back 12, 13 years ago, and started from a little tiny platform that they built themselves to trade equities in India, to try and solve some of the technology, user experience, and more importantly, cost issues that Indian equity traders faced back then. And that has really transpired to be an enormous success story. And Zerodha today trades around 15% of the entire stock market here in India, making them the country's largest stockbroking platform. The company is wholly owned by the two brothers. They've never had to attract even 1 rupee of external funding. And Nikhil Kamath, the younger brother as well, has had this extraordinary track record as an investor, as a trader, scoring great returns for himself and his brother up until today. What through serendipity and meeting him was really trying to get involved in the other end of the spectrum. Zerodha is all about the retail market, 2.5 million or so individuals who are on their platform now trading equities, but it is across the entire country and widely accessible. To the other end of the spectrum, this is an end that I know about well from Standard Chartered. It's ultra high net worth families and how they invest their money. So we've ended up forming a sister company to Zerodha called True Beacon, as you mentioned, and it's really trying to solve 3 problems that ultra high net worth investment space has in it. One is all around human capital, and in particular fund managers. And fund managers globally, 85% of them, I think, don't actually keep up with the markets that they invest into. They score below where the market would have got to with an exchange tracker product. And that is a pretty shocking indictment of fund managers, number one. Number 2 is about product, and there's always some catch. You have to tie up for a long time. The fees are outrageous. There are sometimes fees on fees, sometimes even fees on fees on fees. And there's the end consumer, the client, that really suffers from this. And whether the investments go up or, as you just mentioned about the markets here, they go down, you're still paying the same fees. So we wanted to change that. And then lastly, it's about how and why people invest. They invest for financial return, but they also, I think, want to be part of a community of leading business people, philanthropists, entrepreneurs who can also generate business opportunities. Because one thing I've learned in life is if you put a couple of entrepreneurs in a room together for more than about 5 minutes, they'll come up with something that they can do together. Or even if they don't, they'll learn from each other and they'll use it.
That's like our dinner with Kareem and Alexis.
Correct. Exactly. It always helps if you can put together like-minded people and they're fun as well. But so we're trying to solve those, and so True Beacon is exactly that. We've got a 33-year-old fund manager who's this ultra high net worth himself, the founder of Zerodha, Nikhil, who's really performed well. We launched in September with the aim of outpacing the Nifty 50. Those are the 50 largest stocks in India, very liquid stocks. We wanted to outpace them by about 6 or 8%. We're very fortunate that Nikhil's managed to outpace them as of today by about 26%. We've still got a couple of months to run. So I think we've really solved that issue through this platform. Secondly, we've got a product that has no standing fees to it, so people won't pay us 1 rupee unless we make them money. And we've got co-invested capital in that fund, and it's completely liquid as well, which is also pretty revolutionary for the industry. And then lastly is just creating, as I say, this community of people who not only want to invest, but they also want their families, their individuals, the next generation, all to be on a platform where they can interact with each other globally, learn from each other. Co-investment deals can be thrown up, M&A opportunities, whatever it might be, and we don't charge for that. We just believe that actually, if you've got a leading family on the True Beacon platform, it's what you should be doing for them, but also that business will also be very beneficial because there'll be new products and services that we'll eventually go into in the future.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. It's very exciting.
The India story, it is exciting. I mean, just to touch on very briefly the India story, and again, I'm not I was in banking for a bit, but you could never describe me as a banker or indeed as an economist. But I think one of my observations seeing the India opportunity has always been huge, the opportunity. And I think what's different now? What's different now is we've had continuity of government, whatever your political persuasion is here in India. We now have the Prime Minister on his second term. He's very well known internationally. India, I think, will be an important investment destination for corporates, for pension funds, for sovereign wealth funds in the future, not least because of right now. They've seen the over-reliance on China has meant whether it's your supply chain or your capital or your markets, to have invested very heavily in China at the expense of India, or not to have exposure in India, has proved quite damaging for some of them. So I think India ultimately will be a beneficiary of that. The markets, like every other market around the world, were very heavily battered. They have rebounded, not quite all, but for the vast majority of that downturn now. There will be some pain to come. It's a very volatile market here in India by global standards as well. But the India story is one that you cannot ignore. This economy will be the third largest economy on the planet. It's just a matter of when that will happen, how quickly that will happen. It's obviously got 1.3 billion people, very vibrant. And last but not least, I'd say that particularly sitting down here in Bangalore, this is the tech hub of Asia. You have got some of the brightest young minds anywhere in India, anywhere in the world, who are able to compete with, the key players, whether they be in Silicon Valley or beyond. And that is really exciting for India. A very young population, a vibrant population. And so I think that all bodes well for the future of the economy. But in the short term, obviously, like everything, and we're going through probably a bit more delayed than many other large economies around the world. Here in India, we may well be in the middle of it right now. We have to get out of that situation. But at the end of the day, tragic as though this crisis is, we have to at some stage get back to the business of really trying to raise India as an economy. Too many people depend on India domestically for us not to do that. And also internationally, I think the world does need a counterbalance to China in a post-COVID-19 world.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think I'm very excited to see and to hear about what you guys end up investing in and the logic behind it, and of the next generation of companies that are about to come out. Because, with education bound to be continuously evolving in India and getting better and better, I'm very curious as to, especially with the environment of Bangalore, as you mentioned, with so many bright minds, they'll end up passing the mantle to the next generation as well and teaching them all these skills, whether it's with coding or whether it's with development and the sheer size and the scalability of India as well. You'll see a lot of new apps coming, and I'm very curious and excited to see the developments that will occur over the next decade in the country. And it's very exciting that you're a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing, of course, an obvious observation is that India, in many ways, on the downside, in terms of financial inclusion, for example, 10 years ago, it was a tiny fraction of the country had any access to financial products and services whatsoever. Now it's a completely different story, but in large part because the providers of technology, the financial institutions and so on, have been able to leapfrog existing technologies that might exist in the US or Europe and so on, and just develop their own. And I think the populations have moved straight into that tech platform era rather than going through the rather old-fashioned manual way of doing things as before. So that helps India in its path, I think, to this exciting new kind of chapter.
Definitely. This brings me to the next thing with culture playing an important role. You've been involved with so many different people, and again, it's kind of connected to the globalization from all around the world, whether they're in Africa, Asia, Europe, Middle East. How do cultures intermingle, and what is the beauty of seeing so many different cultures, and what advice do you have, especially if we have any listeners that could be nationalists? What would you say that is very beneficial about actually embracing other cultures and learning from them?
So as I mentioned, during a couple of my chapters, both in the military, when I might be doing a peacekeeping operation with Russian armed forces and Italians and Americans and Spanish and so on, through to again, when I was serving with the Indian Armed Forces, we had exchange military officers from everywhere, from Mongolia to Myanmar and so many militaries around the world, through to being at Standard Chartered, which is in something like 65 countries and with, I forget how many nationalities, but probably it's easier to count how many nationalities are not working for a big international bank like that. But to be part of a team, whether it's in a boardroom setting with me being the only Brit, and to there to be many nationalities represented, to being in a more of a sort of a combat scenario and serving alongside other individuals, I've always really thrived on that. I think. I don't know. Perhaps it's an observation that Brits are more kind of expeditionary than other nations on the planet, just because of our history and our geography, probably. But I definitely feel that I thrive when I'm working with people from different backgrounds and nationalities. My heart sinks if I'm round a table with a whole bunch of middle-aged 51-year-old blokes exactly like me, because that's dull and boring. I'm dull and boring. But to have people from all different
you're the furthest thing from dull and boring, my friend.
just dull. But it's great to have different, not just different nationalities, but different age groups. And I think that's another great way the world of work has really changed, is that you genuinely have an 80-year-old and an 18-year-old working with each other, and they're both learning from each other in different ways. Culturally, across different nationalities, that's not to say it's easy, not least, and I think it probably is even harder, as I mentioned about Zoom, and so we haven't met that person. Some of the non-verbal cues that you have to take from people when you're negotiating, when you're leading, managing, putting together some projects and so on. It's very difficult to do that virtually. It's easier face-to-face, of course, but it's still then, it is difficult. For example, I haven't been to China before I joined Standard Chartered. I've been to Hong Kong, but not China, the mainland. And so, that was a big learning experience for me. I probably haven't invested enough time and haven't been there enough time to probably ever in my lifetime become an expert or to really have a cultural affiliation with China. But do I understand the very, very basics? Yes, I do. And I think that whether you're someone working with me as a Brit or it's the other way around, we have to understand some of the cultural nuances that exist. Some countries are a lot more hierarchical in the world of work. India is, for example. Traditional industries here are very hierarchical. It's changing, but if you are younger, your voice is not quite as loud as if you are older. There's a sort of automatic respect here for age as well, which can also be a double-edged sword. So you have to have, I think, a little bit of cultural affinity, but also to have a little bit of to try to deploy some of your EQ in working out what makes them tick and the culture that they come from and how that influences their business decisions. But by and large, I love it. I mean, there's nothing better for me when I land in a foreign country to go into a business meeting or whatever it might be, and to learn from people and engage with them and to be enthusiastic with them, and to also utterly always treat them with respect that they have. And sadly, with English being the predominant global language, there's sometimes perhaps in Western Europe, the US, and so on, there's a little bit of an arrogance that can creep in just because you have that language as the starting point. point. And when you're talking to someone from a different country, many thousands of miles away, just because they might not have perfect English, absolutely doesn't in any way dilute the message and their thinking and their negotiating position as well. But by and large, it's great fun. It's a great adventure, and hopefully I'll carry on doing it for the rest of my life.
I'm sure you will. I have no doubt in that. Bouncing off of that, what cultural lessons that you've absorbed from different cultures would you want to pass on to your kids? Let's say, give me like a couple or three lessons from different cultures that you'd like your kids to live by and learn.
Yeah. So it's a good question. I'm not sure it's through my own lens, but again, a couple of observations of my kids being very fortunate to have grown up in a very multicultural part of London, the centre of London, and I'm a huge believer in the value of not only foreigners who come to London to live and embrace the UK, who will eventually go back to their countries, but also immigration, people who will come in and be part of our society. And you look over London in particular, the UK in general, that's been a massive driver of our economy. I think looking through my children, and since they went to schools right in the centre of London, they genuinely don't even think about the background, nationality, skin colour, sex of the children that they've been part of the cohort of. And that is so incredibly refreshing. And again, it sounds almost sort of shameful to say it now, but I come from a little part of Britain called Shropshire. When I was growing up, 50 years ago, it was, you just didn't have anyone from outside, the normal white communities that have pervaded there for hundreds of years. It's changed, of course, now for the better. But my first exposure to people from around the world was really going to university, in addition to a little bit of travel and so on. So I think things are changing anyway. I think that what we have to do, we've got a responsibility to try and make sure that there is an equality of opportunity for everybody. And so number one for my own kids is about never, reading a book by its cover in isolation, getting to know the human being who's in there. Second one is that, wherever my three kids end up settling, and who knows where that will be around the world, who they're going to end up falling in love with, and where they're going to start families, or where they're going to suddenly have a job opportunity, and they'll probably live in a few different countries and stuff. But if you throw yourself into that country, you try not to rail against it. Generally, people are very appreciative of that, I think. And that's what I've done here in India ever since I first came. You can, as a foreigner, you can be very frustrated by this country because, things don't necessarily run like clockwork. It's not necessarily the most organized economy or infrastructure in the world. A lot of it's still developing very quickly and so on. So, if you're a foreigner, some foreigners, rail against that and go, they're shocked. But on the other hand, if you embrace that in a way, and it's not just to say, to roll with it and nothing ever gets done, but also to see that as a bit of a challenge, it can be really beneficial. And I think if you can throw yourself into a new culture very quickly, that is also beneficial for them too. And last but not least, I guess I would say for my own kids, my own observation is that, again, whether you're serving with people from different nationalities or working with them and so on, if you can make an effort to get to know the person, to get to know them as an individual, their family members, their background, that really helps you. It's quite a big investment. I think particularly in the corporate world, it's easier just to, sit next to someone. I find it hilarious in the corporate world how people can sit next to each other for genuinely, 12 years and barely know anything apart from their first names. Whereas actually getting to know people around you, getting to know their story, being very open with them, I think there is probably zero short-term gain in that, but in the long-term or medium-term, it always comes back to be very beneficial because you always need them, they'll need you. And if you start off with a basis of forming a real human connection. That I think is really valuable.
Definitely. I think with that, I just wanted to thank you so much, Richard, for joining us today in this episode. It's been incredible to catch up with you, and I'm glad that you finally get to visit the family and then get a well-deserved vacation after all the madness that the entire world has gone through. Look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. No, thank you, guys. It's been fun chatting to you. I look forward to seeing you, obviously, in person really soon. But I wish you great success with this series, and I'm sure I shall be one of the most dismal and dull people you have on your series. But I think it's always interesting, just to finish off, hearing people's life stories. I'm endlessly fascinated by people, including you and your family and so on, about how people got to where they are and the journey that they're on. And I think that even in a tiny way, if people find, a few things that I've done either bizarre or interesting, that's good. But I've learned from people's stories. That's in particular what I loved at Standard Charter, was meeting all these amazing entrepreneurs. And very often the people who on the outside have achieved hugely have actually been people who've come almost from nothing, or have, as we were chatting about earlier, really failed in life and then turned their lives around. I think those are some of the most compelling stories.
I agree. And I think that's why we connected as well. I love for sondering and witnessing different lives and the great aspects of individuals and how we can come together despite our differences in cultural backgrounds, and how we can always have a blast regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a vital ingredient of life. Yeah.
Well, see you, Richard. Have a great day.
Okay. Thanks, Colin. Thanks so much.